Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappelle. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers. On this episode, we are discussing the black comedy Parasite, and then we'll end with a critique of one lucky author's query.
Okay, here come the spoilers. The Kim family lives in a basement apartment, and they're really poor, and they struggle just to keep food on the table. They take on these odd jobs for cash, so they show them doing all kinds of stuff like folding pizza boxes, and they rely on like unprotected Wi-Fi networks if they're neighbors, and then like the pesticides that they use on the street in order to keep their own home insect-free. The son is given a scholar's stone by a friend, as well as a recommendation for a tutoring job with this wealthy family, the Parks. So then he and his sister fake credentials for the job, and it starts this long con where each member of the Kim family works their way into the Park family one by one. So the son starts with the job as an English tutor, and then the daughter gets a job as an art therapy teacher. Then the Kims have the Park chauffeur removed so the dad can take his place. Then they do the same thing with the housekeeper who had been with the Parks like forever, and the mom takes her place. So once the whole family is employed with the Park household, the Kims start to take on more and more of this like fabricated identity of being wealthy. So then as we kind of approach the midpoint, the Parks go out of town and the Kims sort of take over their home as their own. And then there's this huge twist that I never expected, I never saw coming, that the old housekeeper shows up again and says she forgot something in the basement, and it turns out to be her husband, who's been living there without the Park's knowledge while he hides from sharks. So she begs the Kims to let him keep living there, and they refuse, and then sort of accidentally out themselves about their con. She threatens to reveal them, and then this crazy fight breaks out, and at the same time a rainstorm brings the Park family back home early, so they have to sort of scramble to get everything under control, and the Kims manage to go back to their own house, and it seems like they're going to be okay. So then they come back the next day and they find that the old housekeeper died, and her husband gets out of the basement and attacks them. So then at this point, like, everything breaks into total turmoil as the old housekeeper's husband kills the daughter. Then the dad finally just kind of loses it and kills Mr. Park, not the housekeeper's husband. So it all ends up with the mother and son of the Kim family are convicted of fraud, and then they're just put on probation. And the dad has just sort of disappeared. Then sort of at the very end, we find out that he made it into the bunker in the basement and is now trapped like the old housekeeper's husband was. And when the son realizes, he vows to make enough money to buy the house himself and free his father one day. So, Carly, what did you think of this movie?
I loved it, which I say a lot because we only watch good movies.
We do only watch good movies.
It's true. And I know I say this every single time, but the cinematography was like amazing.
It really was. It was so crisp. Like,
yes,
there was no
a great
like
word.
softness about it, really. It was just, it really came through as very crisp to me.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good word for it. It was just beautiful. And I kind of really want the house.
Yeah.
Including the hidden bunker.
Definitely.
Who doesn't need a hidden bunker?
Right?
I mean, come on. And the characters just felt really real to me.
Yes.
Like, I totally know those parents that think their kid is a prodigy, but really they're just out of control. And just, I don't know. I was just really into how real everyone was. And, like, how the Parks felt that they were really close with their staff, but really they were just terrible to them. That kind of fake, we're all friends here kind of a vibe. And then the Kim family was just really interesting, and like their interactions with each other and the Parks were just like very realistic and fascinating, and just, I don't know, I just was really intrigued by the whole thing. And I really loved the humor too. I'm a huge sucker for black comedies.
Me too.
It was just so wry and funny and all about like the dark, dry delivery. I'm really a big fan of like blunt delivery. It's just good. And I felt like for such a dark movie with like that crazy dark ambiance, I was surprisingly like cracking up at a lot of points. And I just thought it was like really masterful. I don't know. I loved it. What do you think?
Okay, so yeah, I totally agree that the characters really came through as real, very, which I think is funny because it was sort of like all of these really ridiculous, absurd situations, but the characters themselves feel really real, and I felt like they were very easy to connect with from the very beginning. And so I think that's it's a combination of great writing and really great acting as well. I think this movie was like really sparse on dialogue.
It was.
Which was really interesting. And so it means that the actors themselves had to pull off a lot through body language, facial expressions, those kinds of things. So I give the actors a lot of credit as well. And I am pretty sure I literally gasped when I saw the housekeeper's husband in the basement. And then kind of laughed at myself a little. And so it takes a lot to surprise me in a movie. So that was like this really big twist that was actually kind of a shock for me. It was really my favorite kind of thing where like I felt like the housekeeper was a little off and weird, especially like when she comes back and she's all like super giggly and stuff.
She's definitely up to something.
Yeah, exactly. But you don't know exactly what it is. And I definitely didn't expect something like that.
No.
So I wanted to talk for a little bit about what black comedy is for any listeners who aren't familiar with the term. So like what it is, what distinguishes it as a genre, why it works for this movie. So black comedy centers around like dark humor, even gallows humor, and often focuses on like taboo subjects. It's not really surprising that you and I would both like black comedies a lot because we're very sarcastic. We have very dark senses of humor. And so it's not really surprising. If you're not like really get sarcasm, black comedy may not be the best thing for you because it is very often delivered in this very like dry, just deadpan kind of way. So in the purest definition of the word, comedies are supposed to have happy endings, but like a dark or black comedy often doesn't. This one definitely doesn't. In the case of this ovie, the writers use that dark humor to explore that class discrimination and the effects of greed on society. And it really allowed them to use this sort of like that absurdity that I mentioned to highlight some very real concerns. It kind of shows the worst of human behavior through this lens of the ridiculous. So it lets them kind of exaggerate realities. But honestly, it's like I said, it's not really all that unbelievable. Like I bought in from the beginning.
Yeah.
And then there's this really well done parallel between like the old housekeeper and her husband and the Kim family, seeing how like they both took advantage of this rich family, but that the Parks really treat everyone like they're inferior, and seem totally out of touch with the real world. So it's hard to feel bad for them in any way.
Yeah, I really don't.
Yeah, and kind of everybody in this movie is kind of a terrible person.
Yeah.
And so it really feeds into that really dark humor. And I think honestly that's what I loved most about it. So what did you think this movie did well that writers could use in their own work?
Basically everything you just said.
Podcast over.
Okay. No. But really it just played really well with viewer expectations. So in this case, we're going to discuss reader expectations because, you know, books.
Right.
But it was the viewer expectations. So you want to surprise your readers. Why? Because you want to keep them entertained. But surprising readers is surprisingly hard. Not to overuse that word, but whatever.
You get bonus points for puns, sort of. Wordplay.
Is it a pun?
It's wordplay.
I don't think
it's wordplay.
Okay, I think that's generous. But thank you. It's just that there's a million books out there, and there's a million movies and TV shows, and we're all consuming different forms of media that reinventing something never really quite works. It's hard to fully, completely surprise somebody because most things have been done before. And if you go the complete opposite direction, it doesn't feel true. It feels like a bit of a stretch or a cop-out.
Yeah, it's kind of that concept of like every story has already been told.
Right.
So we're just kind of putting new spins on old stories.
Exactly. So you need to give readers what they expect.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't want to give them something completely out of the blue. Give them what they expect, but then find a way to still twist it into something new to delight them, basically. Mm-hmm. And I know that can sound really complicated, but it's easier than you think. It's all about striking that balance between comfort and surprise. You want to make your readers feel safe, but then spin it in a way that makes them surprisingly uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to continue to use surprise every sentence, so have fun with that. So basically, you want to find a way to turn left when your readers expect you to turn right, but still stay on the road. You don't want to go like off-roading. Right. To give you an analogy that may or may not help you, but it's a good image. And in this movie, we're really lulled into a sense of thinking we know where and when it will twist. But then it ends up twisting in a different way than we expected. So, like we were saying, we know something's going on with the old housekeeper.
Yeah.
What was going on with her was completely out of the blue, at least to us.
Right.
What'd you think?
Right. Yeah. So I think I want to touch a little bit on what you said about how playing with reader expectations in a book is really tricky. In a movie too. In any kind of storytelling, it's really hard to strike that balance between comfort and surprise. In publishing, publishers and agents always say, like, we want something fresh, but it seems like anything that is too far outside the box, like, they don't know what to do with it. Mm-hmm. So it is that balance of like feeling familiar enough that readers have some idea what they're getting themselves into, and also publishers know where your book needs to sit on a bookshelf, but then also switching it up so that it's not totally predictable, because predictability isn't a great trait in a story. It can even push then into cliches and stereotypes if you aren't conscious of it. So when you think carefully about your readers' expectations, you can use that intentionally. I feel like that's something we've talked about a lot on this podcast, is, knowing the rules so you can use them and even break them with intention. So it's not just about surprises like this big one we talked about. It's also about the suspense. So like we've been talking about this old housekeeper. So like when she asks if they want to come into the basement with her, like right away I was like, yeah, something is definitely up with whatever is going on in the basement. And my mind immediately starts going through like, does she have a meth lab down there? Or is she like, is there like an experimentation area where she's like killing people, or like what's happening? But we know there's something creepy going on in there, right?
Yes.
And that is playing with that reader or that viewer, in this case, expectation. Like, we all know nothing good ever happens in the basement in a movie.
Never. I hate my basement. It's the worst.
So it's using this expectation that we have as viewers, based on our own experiences with creepy basements, and this understanding we have from watching lots of movies and TV shows and reading lots of books where bad stuff happens to characters once they get in the basement. So if nothing else, like, basements are where we hide things away, tuck things out of sight. So we get that sense of there being secrets and, like, who knows what that's in there. So that is, when we see that, we have some idea of what might happen. So yeah, I think that it's important to know, for example, when your reader sees you're going into a basement, that's what they're going to be expecting. They're going to be expecting something weird or bad or creepy is going to happen. And when you know that, then you can make an intentional decision about what happens from that point on.
Exactly. So, like, when she offered for them to go, or for the mom to go into the basement with her, I was like, oh, well, she's going to just kill her then, I guess, if she goes into the basement. Right. Like, that's the only answer. And then when she said no to going in the basement, I was like, good choice. You would have been murdered. But anyway, so I was surprised too, basically. And I'd known going into this that there was going to be a massive twist. That's what everyone talked about. No one spoiled it. But, like, I knew there was going to be some big thing that was shocking. So I was mildly prepared, but I assumed there would be something going on with the old housekeeper, but I never once ever thought it could be her husband hiding in the basement.
That thought literally never crossed my mind.
Never crossed my mind. I don't know if that's just my little sheltered life, but I didn't think that was a thing. So we're all prepared for her to go into the basement, and either she attacks them or I was kind of thinking she might grab, like, a piece of evidence to blackmail the Parks with. But instead, there's the husband. The only clue that we get that there is a husband down there, at least that I kind of picked up on, was that the old housekeeper ate enough for 2 people. But even then, when it's brought up, she's like, oh, no, I brought him my own food that I paid for. Like, she kind of dismisses the clue. And then we get this, like, crazy vaudevillian scene of everyone's running around trying to get the phone with the evidence that she got about the Kims being related. She records them on their phone. And it just gets to be crazy, and everyone's kind of running around, and it continues and to get even crazier when we find out that the Parks are about to arrive home. Right. So they're trying to cover up their mess, like the typical teenager hiding evidence of a party. So it's this interesting mix of, like, slapstick style antics and sheer brutality. It's really dark and awful.
It is, and it's a big departure from sort of the tone and everything from the first half of the movie. So, like,
it's a big tonal shift.
Big twist, it makes it almost feel like a different movie, because there is just this big shift, not just in the storyline, but also the tone and the mood for the characters. So that was, I think, part of sort of that shock and surprise factor as well.
It's not just there's a husband, it's getting violent. Yeah. Because they end up giving the old housekeeper, like, a deadly concussion. It's very clear she's going to die. And it takes what you expect of those, like, slapstick comedies, but then shows that brutality simmering underneath. Like, if you think of Three Stooges, they were violent and awful, and, like, people would be dead if they actually did any of those antics. Right. And it kind of shows the true nature of that, and, like, how people find that deadliness amusing in a way. It's just really interesting how it plays with that. And then in the end, the next big twist is Key-Take, the father, ends up killing the Park father, the husband. But we've seen the Parks criticize the way he smells a few times, so, like, We've seen them be kind of mean to him, but usually it's kind of presented in a comical way, like his kids kind of tease him for it, and it's a little bit brushed off. But then in the end, all it takes when his entire family has been attacked is for the Parks to kind of scrunch their noses, and then he takes snaps and kills the man. And the chaos of that moment turns what could have been, again, another slapstick kind of moment with, like, the old housekeeper's husband coming up and, like, surprising everybody. It turns it into something much more darker and sinister. And it grapples with, like, classism and heartache and how he's dealing with all of these different emotions at once. So, like, this movie is constantly oscillating between the comical and the suspenseful and merging those two genres to give us something new and unexpected.
Yeah, you're right. And I hadn't really thought about that until you said that. But yes, I was really surprised, too, when he kills the Park father.
Yep.
Because that isn't how you expect that scene to play out. Like, here's this other guy who's been living in this basement, and the only times we see him, he almost acts like a wild person, you know, like,
yeah.
And especially in this scene, like, he has just seriously injured, if not killed, the son and daughter of the Kim family. And so by this point, you know, it really did surprise me. You would expect for the father to go for killing this person or attacking this person who has just hurt his family members. And you see this moment where he's, like, kind of torn on what to do. But it still kind of surprised me that he went with that. I'm going to not only am I going to choose this moment to confront this person about insulting me over and over, but I'm just going to kill him.
Yep.
I'm just going to grab a knife and kill him.
Yep.
So yeah, it was surprising, and it definitely, I think, it really underlines that theme of classism,
yes.
of, you know, that his family is poor and that they've done all these things to try to get ahead, but, you know, they feel like they can't get rid of that stigma, and that it's really turned him desperate.
Exactly.
So yeah, so I hadn't even thought about that until you said that, but it really, that surprised me too. I think I was just still kind of in shock from the big surprise of, oh my goodness, there's like this guy living in their basement. Yeah. So I love when movies have those kinds of twists. Like I said, for someone who takes in a lot of storytelling in its various forms, it can be really hard to be truly surprised by a twist in a story.
Seriously.
Yeah, and even when you aren't surprised, though, it's still fun to see how the author creates something new from a lot of old tropes. Because that's kind of what we were just saying about, like, knowing that the housekeeper was up to something. So we knew something was going to happen. And so when I was thinking, like, she's going to be a serial killer, or she's going to have a meth lab or whatever, my brain was cycling through all of the tropes of... Yep. You know, what could this person who's up to no good, what could they be doing?
What have I seen before?
Yeah, exactly. So that's really what we're talking about here is tropes. I think trope has become kind of a bad word in writing circles, but it doesn't have to be. A trope is really just a commonly used device or like a theme or a motif. And so every story uses tropes, whether it's a movie, a TV show, book, play, video game. Kind of anything that has a story, it's using those tropes. And it only becomes problematic when the writer relies on cliches and stereotypes instead of using those tropes to create something new. So this goes back to what I was saying about knowing what your reader will expect. So for examples of some tropes, like some common examples are love triangles, the chosen one, kind of like assembling your team. Or something even as simple as like the bad guys wear black kind of thing. So as readers and viewers, as consumers of media, we pick up on those tropes from an early age. So from the first time you start having books read to you, you're watching cartoons, you are taking in those tropes without even realizing that that's what you're doing. So by the time you become a strong reader, much less start to write your own stories, so many tropes are already established in your consciousness. So it can take a lot of work to start seeing those common elements as what they are, because it's not something that you think about on a conscious level. It's part of why it's so important to read widely in your genre. It's also important to know, though, those tropes in movies and TV, because that's also at work in your reader's mind, even though they probably aren't even aware of it. A really great place to see some more examples of tropes so that you can start looking for them better is tvtropes.org. It's literally just this giant database of tropes with examples of how they've been used. And it is typically in like TV shows and movies, but it just kind of helps to familiarize you with the kinds of things that tropes are. And sort of once you start seeing it, as like a lot of things with writing, it's hard to unsee it.
Yep.
So then my other tip about that is when you start studying tropes for your own writing, it can be really helpful to read other stories, specifically with tropes in mind. So when you read a new book, try to identify where you think the story was going, or what you think a character is going to be like. Did the author do what you expected them to do? And if they didn't, did they set it up with something familiar and then change it so that it's a little different than what you expected? And so, like with a lot of things with writing, when you start seeing that in other writing, then it's easier to start seeing it in your own.
Exactly. And it's important to know the tropes of your genre specifically too, and knowing the expectations that readers are going to have going in. And I completely agree. Tropes have become a bit of a dirty word in writing, but they shouldn't be. They're a tool for your writing like any other, and they can be used really, really well when you subvert them. And the key to subverting a trope is to know them. Right. So do your research, as Jenny says.
Always do what Jenny says. That's really the lesson to take away here.
Unless I contradict her and then do what I say. But, yeah. Usually we agree, though, so that's fine.
We do usually.
It's fine. But then find where you're building a trope and figure out what you can do differently with it. So just for some examples, say you've created a chosen one. Maybe at the midpoint, we discover that they weren't the chosen one after all, and it's somebody else. Or how would that fallout change the story? How would it change the character? What is it going to do that's going to build and be different? Or if you've been building a love triangle around like a central character, what if the other members of the triangle fall in love with each other instead?
I want to read that story.
I know.
That sounds really good.
I just came up with it and I was like, ooh, okay.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Thank you. Someone should write that for us. But so it's all about recognizing the trope and then playing with the expectations tied to it.
Right.
So again, like Jenny said earlier, we expect something bad to happen in the basement if they follow her down. But we don't expect to find someone down there that needs help. We expect there to be something bad, something that makes us hate the old housekeeper. But instead, it almost makes her more relatable. I don't know if that's the exact word I'm going for, but it makes her a little bit more understandable, I guess. And then, like, during the garden party massacre, let's call it, we expect the husband to avenge his wife's death by coming up and killing the Kim family. But we don't expect Ki-taek to then turn on the Park father. So as you're working on your story, see what kind of groundwork you're laying. Where would readers expect the story to go? How can you do it differently? What clues are you leading to that you can then subvert? But be really careful to not do anything out of left field. You still want to grow it organically, and you still want it to make sense, even if it's not expected.
Right. Right. Yeah. So subverting tropes is awesome, but it can also create problems, depending on how you do it. Again, as with most things with writing, execution is sort of everything. So you have to be really careful in how you approach that, like, trope subversion. So one way it can cause issues in a story is when you subvert the trope, but it doesn't really have any impact on the story. I think the reason this is a problem is if you surprise the reader or make something happen that's different than what they expect, this is going to stand out in their mind. So then if it has no impact in the story, it will feel really unnecessary. So, for example, if you're playing with gender stereotypes of a certain character, but then that doesn't have any impact on the character or the plot, you're missing this opportunity to take that, kind of deepen that fresh take on the trope, and it can leave your story feeling flat. So I want to use a recent and controversial example.
Oh, no, Jenny.
So please don't throw your phone or laptop across the room when I say these words.
I'm already preparing to flip my computer. The podcast may stop recording any minute.
The final season of Game of Thrones.
Flipping the computer. No, it's okay. Continue.
A lot of longtime fans of the show were really disappointed that the writers of the show chose to play with the viewers' expectations by making characters do things that seemed outside of the boundaries they'd established for those characters. So I saw a lot of complaints that they had worked to change these characters so that the characters would experience growth over the course of the series. And then in the end, the characters sort of did exactly what you would have expected them to do from season 1. So I think that was really disappointing for a lot of people, because even though no one knew what would happen at the end, and the actual ending was kind of the last thing anyone would have expected, it felt flat because the tropes were subverted in a way that felt unnecessary and didn't really lead to anything surprising or new. It was kind of like, well, we could have just ended this in season 1 if we hadn't, if we weren't going to change the characters or anything over the course of it. So it can also be problematic when you're changing up tropes and it misleads the reader. So, like, if you're going to have this, like, quirky love triangle and then the reader thinks they're getting into a rom-com, but then you kill off both of the love interests and the story ends up actually being about grief, you've played with the reader's expectations in a way that has a negative effect on them. So always think about the impact you want to have on your reader as you change up your tropes, and use your beta readers and critique partners to make sure you're having that intended impact. Remember, too, when it comes to beta readers and critique partners, don't ever be afraid to ask specific questions, either before you send them your manuscript or afterwards, to make sure you get clarity on whatever they've told you.
Yes, those are fantastic examples. I'm not going to get into a debate about the end of Game of Thrones.
Well, I'm not saying I necessarily thought that, or did or did not think that. I'm not politicizing
it. I'm just saying that would be a whole other podcast.
It would be. Although now I'm super curious.
It's not. I don't have very hot takes on it. Don't worry. Anyway. So you want to be intentional with your subversions, basically. You want to push the boundaries in really thoughtful ways that make sense and build on each other.
Right.
One reason these twists work so well in the movie is that they feel organic to the story. So while they're surprising, none of it seems crazy out of the ordinary because the story builds to those plot points. Keatek has been insulted by the Parks for a very long time. It isn't out of the blue for him to lash out at such a chaotic moment. Like, the story's been talking about classism. You expect for the underprivileged family to lash out at the overprivileged family. But the movie is kind of constantly oscillating, like I kind of said earlier, between comedy and thriller. So we aren't ever too caught out by that crazy tonal shift, because every scene has, like, both of those tones threaded throughout them.
Right.
We're seeing comedy and thriller and tension and suspense in all of the scenes. So even though we have that kind of big tonal shift at the midpoint, it doesn't feel like, oh my God, this is a completely different movie than what I signed up for, because it's slowly been built in there.
Right.
They basically complement each other without like detracting from each other.
Right. Yeah, totally agree with all of that. Did you feel like you had a female side character in this movie
did.
that you wanted to know more about?
Yes, and I'm checking my notes because it was like one of my first notes that I wrote down was like, this is the female side character that I need. And it's basically the Kim daughter.
Yeah.
I just thought she was so interesting, and the way she like seamlessly lies in the beginning and like turns into this art therapy teacher and just gets the Parks like under control with just like things she's making up as she goes along. I just thought she was really the con woman of the whole family. She was the person that could orchestrate things really well.
Yeah.
And honestly, if she was the one that lived, I feel like she'd be able to buy that house back.
Oh, yeah.
In like a year.
And it's funny because she was definitely like the least developed of all of the Kim family in terms of like giving her screen time and something to do in the story. I think she was really kind of the least important to the story as far as that goes. So I think I can totally see that, but I'm also really torn about the housekeeper. Like, just that, I think I really started feeling it when she came back to, I guess, get her husband.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the plan was.
I'm not sure what the plan was either, but it just made me so curious about her, like what her life had been that led to these choices. And
right.
Yeah, I wanted to see more of her. I felt like if we had had more of her in that story, it would have been really interesting.
It would have. Well, and especially, can you imagine, like, after you're fired, being like, how do I feed my husband? He's just stuck in a basement.
It's crazy.
Got to get back in there.
It's crazy. It also makes me wonder more about like kind of the origin of the bunker and why the Park family didn't seem to know it was there and kind of all of that. I have a lot of questions about the backstory here. Yeah. So let's move on to our query. This month our query is an adult psychological thriller with some light supernatural elements. It's basically about a woman who suspects that her new love interest might be a murderer and that she's being haunted by his victim. So there's lots of intense elements here that definitely grab my interest. What did you think?
I thought it was really, really intriguing. I'm going to just kind of focus on the bad here because that's what our critique is for. I did really like it, and I would totally read this book, but I think the main reason it fell a little flat for me in the query is that it was very short. And we're getting a lot of the plot straight out of the gate, and it's not building that suspense that you expect from the genre. Like, I want to feel the tension and the suspense in your query. I felt like a little bit too much was over-explained. So, like, I almost knew too much of what to expect from the story and where the twists were going to come. And I wanted more about your main character and more tension built into it. So like the first paragraph should focus on building up the romance she's fostering and how the stalker is invading her space and what that feels like and what that means for her. And then the second paragraph could lead to the twists and show how everything isn't what she originally thought. But like, don't give everything away. And I feel like a little bit too much was given away. So basically just dig deeper into your main character and give us more of who they are and build more of that suspense. Hint at those big reveals without telling us them.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think my notes were very similar, if like worded a little differently. So I felt like overall the structure was an issue. Yes, it's too short. A good query can be like 350 to 450 words, so you have plenty of room here to add. In addition, I thought that I'd really like to see the first paragraph. You have like this one big paragraph that you could split it into two. Start the new paragraph with, but when she discovers a news clipping. I think that's kind of what Carly was saying, is we want that first paragraph to really focus on the character, and then the second one is going to launch more into the conflict. So in that first paragraph, I'd like to see more focus on kind of the character's emotional wound and how the events of the plots tie into that. So, like, tell us why she feels like this romance is going to be good for her and how she thinks it could kind of fix that emotional wound. Then in the last paragraph of the summary, show what obstacles specifically she has to overcome and how that will force her to confront her own inner demons. That's really what gives a lot of stakes to the story. So, touching on the emotional wound in the first paragraph of the plot summary and then calling back to it in the final dilemma is really an essential part of a good query. That final dilemma is very often kind of phrased as like the main character has to decide between X bad thing and Y facing their inner demons or something terrible is going to happen. So I think, Carly, to me, from what you said, it kind of seems like you felt like maybe they were giving too much away, and I read it more as like they weren't necessarily giving us specific details on what the obstacles are. So I'm not sure which one of those is the case. Like, if you're giving us, I think
it's both.
It's possible, yeah. So I wasn't sure, like, if you were giving us too much of what was happening, or just not focusing enough on why it matters that that's what was happening. So,
right. I think it's both. I think it's give us why it matters and maybe pull back a little bit on revealing that big twist, because I felt like I got the big twist and I didn't quite want to know what it was. I wanted to see hints of it. Anyway, on our next podcast, we will be discussing the comedy The Lovebirds. We will also have another query or blurb critique. If you want your query or blurb featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram @StoryChatRadio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.